Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects by Giorgio Vasari.
Life of Filippo Brunelleschi, Filippo di Ser Brunellesco, Sculptor and Architect. Many men are created by nature, small in person and in features, who have a mind full of such greatness and a heart of such irresistible vehemence that if they do not begin difficult, nay, almost impossible undertakings, and bring them to completion to the marvel of all who behold them, they have never any peace in their lives. And whatsoever work chance puts into their hands, however lowly and base it may be, they give it value and nobility. Wherefore, no one should turn up his nose when he encounters people who have not, in their aspect, that primal grace or beauty which nature should give on his coming into the world to a man who works at any art, seeing that there is no doubt that beneath the clods of the earth are hidden veins of gold. And very often, in those who are most insignificant in form, there are born so great generosity of mind and so great sincerity of heart that, if nobility be mingled with these, nothing short of the greatest marvels can be looked for from them, for the reason that they strive to embellish the ugliness of the body with the beauty of the intellect, as it is clearly seen in Filippo di Ser Brunellesco, who was no less insignificant in person than Messer Forese de Rabata and Giotto, but so lofty in intellect that it can be truly said that he was sent to us by heaven in order to give new form to architecture, which had been out of mind for hundreds of years, for the men of those times had spent much treasure to no purpose, making buildings without order, with bad method, with sorry design, with most strange inventions, with most ungraceful grace, and with even worse ornament. And heaven ordained, since the earth had been for so many years without any supreme mind or divine spirit, that Filippo should bequeath to the world the greatest, the most lofty, and the most beautiful building that was ever made in modern times, or even in those of the ancients, proving that the talent of the Tuscan craftsman, although lost, was not therefore dead. Heaven adorned him, moreover, with the best virtues, among which was that of kindliness, so that no man was ever more benign or more amiable than he. In judgment he was free from passion, and when he saw worth and merit in others, he would sacrifice his own advantage and the interest of his friends. He knew himself, he shared the benefit of his own talent with many, and he was ever succoring his neighbors in his necessities. He declared himself a capital enemy of vice and a friend of those who practiced virtue. He never spent his time uselessly, but would labor to meet the needs of others, either by himself or by the agency of other men. And he would visit his friends on foot, and ever succor them. It is said that there was in Florence a man of very good repute, most praiseworthy in his way of life and active in his business, whose name was Ser Brunellesco di Lippo Lapi, who had had a grandfather called Cambio, who was a learned person, and the son of a physician very famous in those times, named Maestro Ventura Baccherini. Now, Ser Brunellesco, taken to wife a most excellent young woman from the noble family of the Spini, received, as part payment of her dowry, a house, wherein he and his sons dwelt to the day of their death. This house stands opposite to one side of San Michele Berteldi, in a close past the Piazza degli Ali. The while that he was occupying himself thus, and living happily in the year 1398, there was born to him a son, to whom he gave the name Filippo, after his own father, now dead, and he celebrated this birth with the greatest gladness possible. Thereupon he taught him in his childhood, with the utmost attention, the first rudiments of letters, wherein the boy, showed himself so ingenious and so lofty in spirit that his brain was often in doubt, as if he did not care to become very perfect in them. Nay, it appeared that he directed his thoughts on matters of greater utility. Wherefore, Ser Brunellesco, who wished him to follow his own vocation of notary, or that of his great-great-grandfather, was very much displeased. But seeing him continually investigating ingenious problems of art and mechanics, he made him learn arithmetic and writing, and then apprenticed him to the goldsmith's art with one of his friends, to the end that he might learn design. And this gave great satisfaction to Filippo, who, not many years after beginning to learn and to practice the art, could set precious stones better than any old craftsman in that vocation. He occupied himself with niello and with making larger works, such as some figures in silver, whereof 2 half-length prophets are placed at the head of the altar of San Jacopo in Pistoia. These figures, which are held very beautifully, were wrought by him for the wardens of works in that city. And he made works in low relief, wherein he showed that he had so great knowledge in his vocation that his intellect must needs overstep the bounds of that art. Wherefore, having made acquaintance with certain studious persons, he began to penetrate with his fancy into questions of time, of motion, of weights, and of wheels, and how the latter can be made to revolve, and by what means they can be set in motion. And thus he made some very good and very beautiful clocks with his own hand. Not content with this, there arose in his mind a very great inclination for sculpture, and this took effect, for Donatello, then a youth, being held an able sculptor and one of great promise, Filippo began to be ever in his company, and the two conceived such great love for each other, by reason of the talents of each, that one appeared unable to live without the other. Whereupon Filippo, who was most capable in various ways, gave attention to many professions, nor had he practiced these long before he was held by persons qualified to judge to be a very good architect, as he showed in many works in connection with the fitting up of houses, such as the house of Apollonio Lapi, his kinsman, in the Canto de Chai, towards the Mercato Vecchio, wherein he occupied himself greatly, while the other was having it built. And he did the same in the tower, and in the house of Petraia at Castello without Florence. In the palace that was the habitation of the Signoria, he arranged and distributed all those rooms wherein the officials of the Monte had their office, and he made doors and windows there in the manner copied from the ancient, which was then little used, for architecture was very rude in Tuscany. In Florence, a little later, there was a statue of lime wood to be made for the friars of San Spirito, representing Saint Mary Magdalene in penitence, to be placed in a chapel. And Filippo, who had wrought many little things in sculpture, desiring to show that he was able to succeed in large works as well, undertook to make the said figure, which, when put into execution and finished, was held something very beautiful. But it was destroyed afterwards, together with many other notable works, in the year 1471, when that church was burnt down. He gave much attention to perspective, which was then in a very evil plight by reason of many errors that were made therein, and in this he spent much time, until he found by himself a method whereby it might become true and perfect, namely, that of tracing it with the ground plan and profile, and by means of intersecting lines, which was something truly most ingenious and useful to the art of design. In this he took so great delight that he drew with his own hand the Piazza di San Giovanni, with all the compartments of black and white marble wherewith that church was encrusted, which he foreshortened with singular grace, and he drew likewise the building of the Misericordia, with the shops of the wafer makers, and the Volta de Pecori, and the column of San Zanobi on the other side. This work, bringing him praise for craftsmen and from all who had judgment in that art, encouraged him so greatly that it was not long before he put his hand to another and drew the palace the piazza, and the loggia of the Signori, together with the roof of the Pisani, and all the buildings that are seen round the piazza. And these works were the means of arousing the minds of the other craftsmen, who afterwards devoted themselves to this with great zeal. He taught, in particular, to the painter Masaccio, then a youth and much his friend, who did him credit in this art that Filippo showed him, as it is apparent from the buildings in his works. Nor did he refrain from teaching it even to those who worked in tarsia, which is the art of inlaying colored woods, and he stimulated them so greatly that he was the source of a good style and of many useful changes that were made in that craft, and of many excellent works wrought both then and afterwards, which have brought fame and profit to Florence for many years. Now Messer Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, returning from his studies, and chancing one evening to be at supper in a garden with some of his friends, invited Filippo, who, hearing him discourse on the mathematical arts, formed such an intimacy with him that he learnt geometry from Messer Paolo. And although Filippo had no learning, he reasoned so well in every matter with his instinct, sharpened by practice and experience, that he would many times confound him. And so he went on to give attention to the study of the Christian scriptures, never failing to be present at the disputations and preachings of learned persons, from which he gained so much advantage by reason of his admirable memory, that the aforesaid Messer Paolo was wont to extol him, and to say that in hearing Filippo argue, he appeared to be hearing a new St. Paul. He also gave much attention at this time to the works of Dante, which he understood very well with regard to the places described and their proportions, and he would avail himself of them in his conversations, quoting them often in making comparisons. He did not else with his thoughts but invent and imagine ingenious and difficult things, nor could he ever find an intellect more to his satisfaction than that of Donato, with whom he was ever holding familiar discourse, and they took pleasure in one another, and would comfort together over the difficulties of their vocation. Now in those days Donato had finished a crucifix of wood, which was placed in San Croce in Florence, below the scene of the child being restored to life by St. Francis, painted by Taddeo Gaddi, and he wished to have the opinion of Filippo about this work. But he repented, for Filippo answered that he had placed a ploughman on the cross, whence there arose the saying, "Take wood and make one thyself," as it is related at length in the life of Donato. Whereupon Filippo, who would never get angry whatever might be said to him, although he might have reason for anger, stayed in seclusion for many months, until he had finished a crucifix of wood of the same size, so excellent, and wrought with so much art, design, and diligence, that Donato, whom he had sent to his house ahead of himself, as it were to surprise him, for he did not know that Filippo had made such a work, having an apron full of eggs and other things for their common dinner, let it fall as he gazed at the work, beside himself with marvel at the ingenious and masterly manner that Filippo had shown in the legs, the trunk, and the arms of the said figure, which was so well composed and united together that Donato, besides admitting himself beaten, proclaimed it a miracle. This work is placed today in Santa Maria Novella, between the chapel of the Strozzi and that of the Bardi da Vernia, and it is still very greatly extolled by the moderns. Wherefore, the talent of these truly excellent masters being recognized, they received a commission from the Guild of Butchers and from the Guild of Linen Manufacturers for 2 figures in marble, to be made for their niches, which are on the outside of Or San Michele. Having undertaken other work, Filippo left these figures to Donato to make by himself, and Donato executed them to perfection. After these things, in the year 1401, now that sculpture had risen to so great a height, it was determined to reconstruct the 2 bronze doors of the church and baptistery of San Giovanni, since, from the death of Andrea Pisano to that day, they had not had any masters capable of executing them. This intention being, therefore, communicated to those sculptors who were then in Tuscany, they were sent for, and each man was given a provision in the space of a year to make one scene. Among those called upon were Filippo and Donato, each of them being required to make one scene by himself, in competition with Lorenzo Ghiberti, Jacopo della Fonte, Simone da Colle, Francesco di Valdambrina, and Niccolo d'Arezzo. These scenes, being finished in the same year and being brought together for comparison, were all most beautiful and different one from the other. One was well designed and badly wrought, as was that of Donato. Another was very well designed and diligently wrought, but the composition of the scene, with the gradual diminution of the figures, was not good, as was the case with that of Jacopo della Quercia. A third was poor in invention and in the figures, which was the manner wherein Francesco di Valdambrina had executed his. And the worst of all were those of Niccolo d'Arezzo and Simone da Colle. The best was that of Lorenzo di Cione Ghiberti, which had design, diligence, invention, art, and the figures very well wrought. Nor was that of Filippo much inferior, wherein he had represented Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and in that scene a slave who is drawing a thorn from his foot while he is awaiting Abraham, and the ass is browsing, deserves no little praise. The scenes then being exhibited, Filippo and Donato were not satisfied with any save with that of Lorenzo, and they judged him to be better qualified for that work than themselves and the others who had made the other scenes. And so, with good reasons, they persuaded the consuls to allot the work to Lorenzo, showing that thus both the public and the private interest would be best served. And this was indeed the true goodness of friendship, excellence without envy, and a sound judgment in the knowledge of their own selves, whereby they deserved more praise than if they had executed the work to perfection. Happy spirits, who, while they were assisting one another, took delight in praising the labors of others. How unhappy are those of our own day, who, not sated with injuring each other, burst with envy while rending others. The consuls besought Filippo to undertake the work in company with Lorenzo, but he refused, being minded rather to be first in an art of his own than an equal or a second in that work. Wherefore he presented the scene that he had wrought in bronze to Cosimo de' Medici, who after a time had it placed on the dorsal of the altar in the old sacristy of San Lorenzo, where it is to be found at present, and that of Donato was placed in the Guild of the Exchange. The commission being given to Lorenzo Ghiberti, Filippo and Donato, who were together, resolved to depart from Florence in company and to live for some years in Rome, to the end that Filippo might study architecture and Donato sculpture. And this Filippo did from his desire to be superior both to Lorenzo and to Donato, in proportion as architecture is held to be more necessary for the practical needs of men than sculpture and painting. After he had sold a little farm that he had at Settignano, they departed from Florence and went to Rome, where, seeing the grandeur of the buildings and the perfection of the fabrics of the temples, Filippo would stand in amaze, like a man out of his mind. And so, having made arrangements for measuring the cornices and taking the ground plans of those buildings, he and Donato kept laboring continually, sparing neither time nor expense. There was no place, either in Rome or in the Campagna without, that they left unvisited, and nothing of the good that they did not measure, if only they could find it. And since Filippo was free from domestic cares, he gave himself over, body and soul, to his studies, and took no thought for eating or sleeping, being intent on one thing only, namely, architecture, which was now dead, the good ancient orders, and not the barbarous German, which was much in use in his time. And he had in his mind two vast conceptions, one being to restore to light the good manner of architecture, since he believed that if he could recover it, he would leave behind no less a name for himself than Cimabue and Giotto had done. And the other was to find a method, if he could, of raising the cupola of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, the difficulties of which were such that after the death of Arnolfo Lapi, there had been no one courageous enough to think of raising it without vast expenditure for a wooden framework. Yet he did not impart this his invention to Donato or to any living soul, nor did he rest in Rome till he had considered all the difficulties connected with the Ritonda, wondering how the vaulting was raised. He had noted and drawn all the ancient vaults, and was for ever studying them. And if, peradventure, they had found pieces of capitals, columns, cornices, and bases of buildings buried underground, they would set to work and have them dug out, in order to examine them thoroughly. Wherefore a rumour spread through Rome as they passed through the streets, going about carelessly dressed, so that they were called the treasure seekers, people believing that they were persons who studied geomancy in order to discover treasure. And this was because they had one day found an ancient earthenware vase full of medals. Filippo ran short of money, and contrived to make this good by setting jewels of price for certain goldsmiths who were his friends, and thus he was left alone in Rome, for Donato returned to Florence, while he, with greater industry and labor than before, was for ever investigating the ruins of those buildings. Nor did he rest until he had drawn every sort of building, round, square, and octagonal temples, basilicas, aqueducts, baths, arches, colossia, amphitheaters, and every temple built of bricks, from which he copied the methods of binding and of clamping with ties, and also of encircling vaults with them. And he noted the ways of making buildings secure by binding the stones together by iron bars and by dovetailing, and, discovering a hole hollowed out under the middle of each great stone, he found that this was meant to hold the iron instrument, which is called by us the ulivella, wherewith the stones are drawn up, and this he reintroduced and brought into use afterwards. He then distinguished the different orders one from another, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and so zealous was his study that his intellect became very well able to see Rome in imagination as she was when she was not in ruins. In the year 1407, the air of that city gave Filippo a slight indisposition, wherefore, being advised by his friends to try a change of air, he returned to Florence. There many buildings had suffered by reason of his absence, and for these, on his arrival, he gave many designs and much advice. In the same year, a congress of architects and engineers of the country was summoned by the wardens of works of Santa Maria del Fiore and by the consuls of the Guild of Wool to discuss methods for raising the cupola. Among these appeared Filippo, giving it as his advice that it was necessary not to raise the fabric directly from the roof according to the design of Arnolfo, but to make a frieze 15 braccia in height, with a large round window in the middle of each of its sides, since not only would this take the weight off the supports of the tribunes, but it would become easier to raise the cupola, and models were made in this way and were put into execution. Filippo, being restored to health after some months, was standing one morning in the Piazza di Santa Maria del Fiore with Donato and other craftsmen, when they began to talk of antiquities in connection with sculpture, and Donato related how, when he was returning from Rome, he had made the journey through Orvieto in order to see that marble facade of the Duomo, a work greatly celebrated, wrought by the hands of diverse masters, and held to be something notable in those times, and how, in passing afterwards by Cortona, he entered the Pieve and saw a very beautiful ancient sarcophagus, whereon there was a scene in marble, a rare thing then, when there had not been on earth that abundance which has been found in our own day. And, as Donato went on to describe the method that the master of that work had used in its execution, and the finish that was to be seen therein, together with the perfection and the excellence of the workmanship, Filippo became fired with an ardent desire to see it, and went off on foot just as he was, in his mantle, cap, and wooden shoes, without saying where he was going, and allowed himself to be carried to Cortona by the devotion and love that he bore to art. And having seen the sarcophagus, and being pleased with it, he made a drawing of it with the pen, and returned with that to Florence, without Donato or any other person knowing that he had been away, for they thought he must have been drawing or inventing something. Having thus returned to Florence, he showed him the drawing of the sarcophagus, which he had made with great patience, whereat Donato marvelled not a little, seeing how much love Filippo bore to art. After this, he stayed many months in Florence, where he kept making models and machines in secret, all for the work of the cupola, exchanging jokes the while with his fellow craftsmen, for it was then that he played the jest of the fat man and Matteo, and going very often for recreation to assist Lorenzo Ghiberti in polishing some part of his doors. But hearing that there was some talk of providing engineers for the raising of the cupola, and being taken one morning with the idea of returning to Rome, he went there, thinking that he would be in greater repute and would be more sought for from abroad than he would be if he stayed in Florence. When he was in Rome, therefore, the work came to be considered, and so, too, the great acuteness of his intellect, for he had shown in his discourse such confidence and such courage as had not been found in the other masters, who, together with the builders, were standing paralyzed and helpless, thinking that no way of raising the cupola could ever be found, nor beams to make a bridge strong enough to sustain the framework and the weight of so great an edifice. And having determined to make an end of the matter, they wrote to Filippo in Rome, praying him to come to Florence. He, desiring nothing better, returned with great readiness, and the wardens of works of Santa Maria del Fiore and the consuls of the Guild of Wool, assembling on his arrival, explained to Filippo all the difficulties, from the greatest to the smallest, which were being raised by the masters, who were in his presence at the audience together with them. Whereupon Filippo spoke these words: "My lords the wardens, there is no doubt that great enterprises ever present difficulties in their execution, and if any ever did so, this of yours presents them, and even greater than perchance you are aware of, for the reason that I do not know whether even the ancients ever raised a vault so tremendous as this will be. And although I have often pondered over the framework necessary both within and without, and how it may be possible to work at it securely, I have never been able to come to any resolution, and I am aghast no less at the breadth than at the height of the edifice, for the reason that, if it could be made round, we might use the method used by the Romans in raising the dome over the Pantheon in Rome, that is, the ritonda, whereas here we must follow the 8 sides, and bind the stones together with ties and by dovetailing them, which will be something very difficult. But, remembering that this is a temple consecrated to God and to the Virgin, I am confident, since this is being done in memory of her, that she will not fail to infuse knowledge where it is lacking, and to give strength, wisdom, and genius to him who is to be the author of such a work. But how can I help you in this matter, since the task is not mine? I tell you, indeed, that if the work fell to me, I would have resolution and courage enough to find a method whereby the vault might be raised, without so many difficulties. But as yet, I have given no thought to it, and you would have me tell you the method. And when at last your lordships determine to have it raised, you will be forced not only to make trial of me, for I do not think myself able to be the sole adviser in so great a matter, but also to spend money and to ordain that within a year, and on a fixed day, many architects shall come to Florence, not merely Tuscans and Italians, but Germans, French, and of every nation, and to propose this work to them, to the end that, after discussing and deciding among so many masters, it may be begun, being entrusted to him who shall give the most direct proof of ability or possess the best method and judgment for such an undertaking. nor could I give you other counsel or a better plan than this." The plan and the counsel of Filippo pleased the consuls and the wardens of works, but they would have liked him, in the meanwhile, to have made a model, to have given thought to the matter. But he showed that he cared nothing for it. Nay, taking leave of them, he said that he had received letters soliciting him to return to Rome, whereupon the consuls, perceiving that their prayers and those of the wardens did not avail to detain him, caused many of his friends to entreat him. But Filippo would not give way, and one morning, on May 26, 1417, the wardens decreed him a present of money, which is found entered to the credit of Filippo in the books of the Office of Works. And all this was to conciliate him. But he, steadfast in his resolution, took his departure none the less from Florence, and returned to Rome, where he studied continuously for that undertaking, making arrangements and preparing himself for the completion of the work, thinking, as was true, that no other than himself could carry it out. And as for his counsel that new architects should be summoned, Filippo had advanced it for no other reason but that they might serve to prove the greatness of his own intellect, and not because he thought that they would be able to vote that tribune or to undertake such a charge, which was too difficult for them. And thus much time was consumed before those architects arrived from their countries, whom they had caused to be summoned from afar by means of orders given to Florentine merchants who dwelt in France, in Germany, in England, and in Spain, and who were commissioned to spend any sum of money, if only they could obtain the most experienced and able intellects that there were in those regions from the princes of those countries, and send them to Florence. By the year 1420, all these ultramontane masters were finally assembled in Florence, and likewise those of Tuscany, and all the ingenious craftsmen of design in Florence. And so Filippo returned from Rome. They all assembled, therefore, in the Office of Works of Santa Maria del Fiore, in the presence of the consuls and of the wardens, together with a select body of the most ingenious citizens, to the end that these might hear the mind of each master on the question, and might decide on a method of voting this tribune. Having called them, then, into the audience, they heard the minds of all, one by one, and the plan that each architect had devised for that work. And a fine thing it was to hear their strange and diverse opinions about the matters, for the reason that some said that piers must be built up from the level of the ground, which should have the arches turned upon them and should uphold the wooden bridges for sustaining the weight. Others said that it was best to make the cupola of sponge stone, to the end that the weight might be less. And many were agreed that a pier should be built in the center, and that the cupola should be raised in the shape of a pavilion, like that of San Giovanni in Florence. Nor were there wanting men who said that it would have been a good thing to fill it with earth mingled with small coins, to the end that, when it had been raised, any one who wanted some of that earth might be given leave to go and fetch it, and thus the people would carry it away in a moment without any expense. Filippo alone said that it could be raised without so much woodwork, without piers, without earth, without so great expenditure on so many arches, and very easily without any framework. It appeared to the consuls, who were expecting to hear of some beautiful method, and to the wardens of works, and to all those citizens, that Filippo had talked like a fool, and deriding him with mocking laughter, they turned away, bidding him talk of something else, seeing that this was the plan of a madman as he was. Whereupon Filippo, feeling himself affronted, answered, "My lords, rest assured that it is not possible to raise the cupola in any other manner than this. And although you laugh at me, you will recognize, unless you mean to be obstinate, that it neither must nor can be done in any other way. And it is necessary, if you wish to erect it in the way that I have thought of, that it should be turned with the curve of a quarter acute arch, and made double, one vault within and the other without, in such a wise that a man may be able to walk between the one and the other. And over the corners of the angle of the 8 sides the fabric must be bound together through its thickness by dovetailing the stones, and its sides, likewise, must be girt round with oaken ties. And it is necessary to think of the lights, the staircases, and the conduits, whereby the rain-water may be able to run off. And not one of you has remembered that you must provide for the raising of scaffoldings within, when the mosaics come to be made, together with an infinite number of difficulties. But I, who see the vaulting raised, know that there is no other method, and no other way of raising it than this that I am describing. And growing heated as he spoke, the more he sought to expound his conception, to the end that they might understand it and believe in it, the greater grew their doubts about his proposal, so that they believed in him less and less, and held him to be an ass and a babbler. Whereupon, having been dismissed several times, and finally refusing to go, he was carried away bodily from the audience by their servants, being thought to be wholly mad. And this affront was the reason that Filippo could afterwards say that he did not dare to pass through any part of the city, for fear lest someone might say, "There goes that madman." The consuls remained in the audience chamber, all confused, both by the difficult methods of the original masters, and by this last method of Filippo's, which they thought absurd, for it appeared to them that he would ruin the work in 2 ways. First, by making the vaulting double, which would have made it enormous and unwieldy in weight, and secondly, by making it without a framework. On the other hand, Filippo, who had spent so many years in study in order to obtain the commission, knew not what to do, and was often tempted to leave Florence. However, wishing to prevail, he was forced to arm himself with patience, having insight enough to know that the brains of the men of that city did not abide very firmly by any one resolution. Filippo could have shown a little model that he had in his possession, but he did not wish to show it, having recognized the small intelligence of the consuls, the envy of the craftsmen, and the instability of the citizens, who favored now one and now another, according as it pleased each man best. And I do not marvel at this, since every man in that city professes to know as much in these matters as the experienced masters know, although those who truly understand them are but few. And let this be said without offense to those who have the knowledge. What Filippo, therefore, had not been able to achieve before the tribunal, he began to effect with individuals, talking now to a consul, now to a warden, and likewise to many citizens, and showing them part of his design. He induced them to determine to allot this work either to him or to one of the foreigners. Wherefore the consuls, the wardens of works, and those citizens, regaining courage, assembled together, and the architects disputed concerning this matter, but all were overcome and conquered by Filippo with many arguments. And here, so it is said, there arose the dispute about the egg in the following manner. They would have liked Filippo to speak his mind in detail, and to show his model, as they had shown theirs. But this he refused to do, proposing instead to those masters, both the foreign and the native, that whosoever could make an egg stand upright on a flat piece of marble should build the cupola, since thus each man's intellect would be discerned. Taking an egg, therefore, all those masters sought to make it stand upright, but not one could find the way. Whereupon Filippo, being told to make it stand, took it graciously, and giving one end of it a blow on the flat piece of marble, made it stand upright. The craftsmen protested that they could have done the same, but Filippo answered, laughing, that they could also have raised the cupola if they had seen the model or the design. And so it was resolved that he should be commissioned to carry out this work, and he was told that he must give fuller information about it to the consuls and the wardens of works. Going to his house, therefore, he wrote down his mind on a sheet of paper as clearly as he was able to give to the tribunal in the following manner. Having considered the difficulties of this structure, magnificent lords wardens, I find that it is in no way possible to raise the cupola perfectly round, seeing that the surface above, where the lantern is to go, would be so great that the laying of any weight thereupon would soon destroy it. Now, it appears to me that those architects who have no regard for the durability of their structures have no love of lasting memorials, and do not even know why they are made. Wherefore, I have determined to turn the inner part of this vault in pointed sections, following the outer sides, and to give to these the proportion and the curve of the quarter acute arch, for the reason that this curve, when turned, ever pushes upwards, so that, when it is loaded with the lantern, both will unite to make the vaulting durable. At the base, it must be 3 braccia and 3/4 in thickness, and it must rise pyramidically, narrowing from without until it closes at the point where the lantern is to be. And at this junction, the vaulting must be 1 braccio and 1/4 in thickness. Then, on the outer side, there must be another vault, which must be 2 braccia and a half thick at the base, in order to protect the inner one from the rain. This one must also diminish pyramidically in due proportion, so that it may come together at the foot of the lantern, like the other, in such wise that at the summit it may be 2/3 of a braccio in thickness. At each angle there must be a buttress, making 8 in all, and in the middle of every side there must be 2 buttresses, making 16 in all, and between the said angles on every side, both within and without, there must be 2 buttresses, each 4 braccia thick at the base. The 2 said vaults, built in the form of a pyramid, must rise together in equal proportion, up to the height of the round window closed by the lantern. There must then be made 24 buttresses, with the said vaults built round them, and 6 arches of grey stone blocks, stout and long, and well braced with irons, which must be covered with tin. And over the said blocks there must be iron ties, binding the said vaulting to its buttresses. The first part of the masonry, up to the height of 5 braccia and 1/4, must be solid, leaving no vacant space, and then the buttresses must be continued and the 2 vaults separated. The first and second courses at the base must be strengthened throughout with long blocks of grey stone laid horizontally across them, in such wise that both vaults of the cupola may rest on the said blocks. At the height of every 9 braccia in the said vaults there must be little arches between one buttress and another, with thick ties of oak to bind together the said buttresses, which support the inner vault, and then the said ties of oak must be covered with plates of iron, for the sake of the staircases. The buttresses must be all built of grey stone and hard stone, and all the sides of the cupola must be likewise of hard stone, and bound with the buttresses up to the height of 24 braccia, and from there to the top the material must be brick, or rather sponge stone, according to the decision of the builder, who must make the work as light as he is able. A passage must be made on the outside above the windows, forming a gallery below, with an open parapet 2 braccia in height, proportionately to those of the little tribunes below, or rather 2 passages, one above the other, resting on a richly adorned cornice, with the upper passage uncovered. The rainwater must flow from the cupola into a gutter of marble, 1/3 of a braccio wide, and must run off through outlets made of hard stone below the gutter. 8 ribs of marble must be made at the angles in the outer surface of the cupola, of such thickness as may be required, rising 1 braccio above the cupola, with a cornice above by way of roof, 2 braccia wide, to serve as gable and eaves to the whole. And these ribs must rise pyramidically from their base up to the summit. The 2 vaults of the cupola must be built in the manner described above, without framework, up to the height of 30 braccia, and from that point upwards in the manner recommended by those masters who will have the building of them, since practice teaches us what course to pursue. Filippo, having finished writing all that is above, went in the morning to the tribunal and gave them that paper, which they studied from end to end. And although they could not grasp it all, yet, seeing the readiness of Filippo's mind, and perceiving that not one of the other architects had better ground to stand on, for he showed a manifest confidence in his speech, ever repeating the same thing in such wise that it appeared certain that he had raised 10 cupolas, the consuls, drawing aside, were minded to give him the work, saying only that they would have liked to see something to show how this cupola could be raised without framework, for they approved of everything else. To this desire fortune was favorable, for Bartolomeo Barbadori, having previously resolved to have a chapel built in Santa Felicita, and having spoken of this to Filippo, the latter had put his hand to the work, and had caused that chapel to be vaulted without framework, at the right hand of the entrance into the church, where the holy water basin is, also made by his hand. In those days, likewise, he caused another to be vaulted beside the chapel of the high altar in San Jacopo sopra Arno, for Stiatta Ridolfi, and these works were the means of bringing him more credit than his words. And so the consuls and the wardens of works, being assured by the writing and by the work that they had seen, gave him the commission for the cupola, making him principal superintendent by the vote with the beans. But they did not contract with him for more than 12 braccia of the whole height, saying to him that they wished to see how the work succeeded, and that if it succeeded as well as he promised, they would not fail to commission him to do the rest. It appeared a strange thing to Filippo to see so great obstinacy and distrust in the consuls and wardens, and, if it had not been that he knew himself to be the only man capable of executing the work, he would not have put his hand to it. However, desiring to gain the glory of its construction, he undertook it, and pledged himself to bring it to perfect completion. His written statement was copied into a book wherein the proveditore kept the accounts of the debtors and creditors for wood and marble, together with the aforesaid pledge. And they undertook to make him the same allowance of money as they had given up to the other superintendents. The commission given to Filippo, becoming known among the craftsmen and the citizens, some thought well of it, and others ill, as it has ever been the case with the opinions of the populace, of the thoughtless, of the envious. The while that the preparations for beginning to build were being made, a faction was formed among craftsmen and citizens, and they appeared before the consuls and the wardens, saying that there had been too much haste in the matter, and that such a work as this should not be carried out by the council of one man alone, that they might be pardoned for this if they had been suffering from a dearth of excellent masters, whereas they had them in abundance, and that it was not likely to do credit to the city, because if some accident were to happen, as is wont to come to pass sometimes in buildings, they might be blamed as persons who had laid too great a charge on one man without considering the loss and the shame that might result to the public interest. Wherefore it would be well to give Filippo a companion in order to restrain his rashness. Now, Lorenzo Ghiberti had come into great repute, by reason of having formerly given proof of his genius in the doors of San Giovanni, and that he was beloved by certain men who were very powerful in the government, was proved clearly enough, since, seeing the glory of Filippo waxing so great, they wrought on the consuls and the wardens so strongly, under the pretext of love and affection towards that building, that he was united to Filippo as his colleague in the work. How great were the despair and the bitterness of Filippo on hearing what the wardens had done may be seen from this, that he was minded to fly from Florence, and if it had not been for Donato and Luca della Robbia, who comforted him, he would have lost his reason. Truly impious and cruel is the rage of those who, blinded by envy, put into peril the honors and the beautiful works of others in their jealous emulation. It was no fault of theirs, in truth, that Filippo did not break his models into pieces, burn his designs, and throw away in less than half an hour all that labor which had occupied him for so many years. The wardens at first made excuses to Filippo and exhorted him to proceed, saying that he himself and no other was the inventor and the creator of so noble a building, but at the same time they gave the same salary to Lorenzo as to Filippo. The work was pursued with little willingness on the part of Filippo, who saw that he must endure the labors that it entailed, and must then divide the honor and the fame equally with Lorenzo. Making up his mind, however, that he would find means to prevent Lorenzo from continuing very long in the work, he went on pursuing it in company with him, in the manner suggested by the writing given to the wardens. Meanwhile, there arose in the mind of Filippo the idea of making such a model as had not yet been made. Wherefore, having put his hand to this, he had it wrought by one Bartolomeo, a carpenter, who lived near the studio. In this model, which had all the exact proportions measured to scale, he made all the difficult parts, such as staircases, both lighted and dark, and every sort of window, door, tie, and buttress, together with a part of the gallery. Lorenzo, hearing of this, wished to see it, but Filippo refused to let him, whereupon he flew into a rage and ordered another model to be made for himself, to the end that he might not appear to be drawing his salary for nothing, and to be of no account in the work. With regard to these models, Filippo was paid 50 lire and 15 soldi for his, as we see from an order in the book of Migliore di Tommaso, dated October 3rd, 1419, whereas 300 lire are entered as paid to Lorenzo Ghiberti for the labor and expense of his model, more in consequence of the friendship and favor that he enjoyed than of any profit or need that the building had of it. This torment lasted before the eyes of Filippo until 1426, the friends of Lorenzo calling him the inventor equally with Filippo, and this annoyance disturbed the mind of Filippo so greatly that he was living in the utmost restlessness. Now, having thought of various new devices, he determined to rid himself entirely of Lorenzo, recognizing that he was of little account in the work. Filippo had already raised the cupola right round, what with the one vault and the other, to the height of 12 braccia, and he had now to place upon them the ties, both of stone and of wood. And as this was a difficult matter, he wished to discuss it with Lorenzo, in order to see if he had considered this difficulty. And he found Lorenzo so far from having thought of such a matter, that he replied that he referred it to Filippo as the inventor. Lorenzo's answer pleased Filippo, since it appeared to him that this was the way to get him removed from the work, and to prove that he did not possess that intelligence which was claimed for him by his friends, and to expose the favor that had placed him in that position. Now, the masons engaged on the work were at a standstill, waiting to be told to begin the part above the 12 braccia, and to make the vaults and bind them with ties. Having begun the drawing in of the cupola towards the top, it was necessary for them to make the scaffoldings, to the end that the masons and their laborers might be able to work without danger, seeing that the height was such that merely looking down brought fear and terror into the stoutest heart. The masons and the other master builders were standing, waiting for directions as to the ties and the scaffoldings, and since no decision was made, either by Lorenzo or by Filippo, there arose a murmuring among the masons and the other master builders, who saw no signs of the solicitude that had been shown before, and because, being poor people, they lived by the work of their hands, and suspected that neither one nor the other of the architects had enough courage to carry the work any further, they went about the building, occupying themselves, to the best of their knowledge and power, with filling up and finishing all that had as yet been built. One morning, Filippo did not appear at the work, but bound up his head and went to bed, and caused plates and cloths to be heated with great solicitude, groaning continually, and pretending to be suffering from colic. The master builders, who were standing waiting for orders as to what they were to do, on hearing this, asked Lorenzo what they were to go on with. But he replied that it was for Filippo to give orders, and that they must wait for him. There was one who said, "What, dost thou not know his mind?" "Yes," answered Lorenzo, "but I would do nothing without him." And this he said to excuse himself, because, not having seen the model of Filippo, and having never asked him what method he intended to follow, he would never commit himself in talking of the matter, in order not to appear ignorant, and would always make a double-edged answer, the more so as he knew that he was employed in the work against the will of Filippo. The illness of the latter having already lasted for more than 2 days, the proveditore and many of the master masons went to see him and asked him repeatedly to tell them what they were to do. And he replied, "You have Lorenzo, let him do something." Nor could they get another word out of him. Whereupon, this becoming known, there arose discussions and very adverse judgments with regard to the work. Some saying that Filippo had gone to bed in his vexation at finding that he had not the courage to raise the cupola, and that he was repenting on having meddled with the matter, while his friends defended him, saying that his anger, if anger it was, came from the outrage of having been given Lorenzo as colleague, but that his real trouble was colic, caused by fatiguing himself overmuch at the work. Now, while this noise was going on, the building was at a standstill, and almost all the work of the masons and stone-cutters was suspended, and they murmured against Lorenzo, saying, "He's good enough at drawing the salary, but as for directing the work, not a bit of it. If we had not Filippo, or if he were ill for long, what would the other do? Is it Filippo's fault that he is ill?" The wardens of works, seeing themselves disgraced by this state of things, determined to go and find Filippo, and after arriving and sympathizing with him first about his illness, they told him in how great confusion the building stood, and what troubles his illness had brought upon them. Whereupon Filippo, speaking with great heat both under the cloak of illness and from love of the work, replied, "Is not that Lorenzo there? Can he do nothing? And I marvel at you as well." Then the wardens answered, "He will do naught without thee." And Filippo retorted, "But I could do well without him." This retort, so acute and double-edged, was enough for them, and they went their way, convinced that Filippo was ill from nothing but the desire to work alone. They sent his friends, therefore, to get him out of bed, with the intention of removing Lorenzo from the work. Wherefore Filippo returned to the building, but seeing that Lorenzo was still strongly favoured, and that he would have his salary without any labour whatsoever, he thought of another method whereby he might disgrace him and demonstrate conclusively his little knowledge in that profession. And he made the following discourse to the wardens in the presence of Lorenzo. "My lords, the wardens of works, if the time that is lent to us to live were as surely ours as the certainty of dying, there's no doubt whatsoever that many things which are begun would be completed instead of remaining unfinished. The accident of this sickness from which I have suffered might have cut short my life and put a stop to the work. Wherefore I have thought of a plan whereby, if I should ever fall sick again, or Lorenzo, which God forbid, one or the other may be able to pursue his part of the work. Even as your lordships have divided the salary between us, let the work also be divided, to the end that each of us, being spurred to show his knowledge, may be confident of acquiring honor and profit from our republic. Now, there are 2 most difficult things which have to be put into execution at the present time. One is the making of the scaffoldings to enable the masons to do their work, which have to be used both within and without the building, where they must support men, stones, and lime, and sustain the crane for lifting weights, with other instruments of that kind. The other is the chain of ties, which has to be placed above the 12 braccia, surrounding and binding together the 8 sides of the cupola, and clamping the fabric together, so that it may bind and secure all the weight that is laid above, in such a manner that the weight may not force it out or stretch it, and that the whole structure may rest firmly on its own basis. Let Lorenzo, then, take one of these two works, whichever he may think himself best able to execute, and I will undertake to accomplish the other without difficulty, to the end that no more time may be lost. Hearing this, Lorenzo was forced, for the sake of his honor, to accept one of these tasks, and, although he did it very unwillingly, he resolved to take the chain of ties as being the easier, relying on the advice of the masons and on the remembrance that, in the vaulting of San Giovanni in Florence, there was a chain of stone ties, wherefrom he might take a part of the design, if not the whole. And so one put his hand to the scaffoldings and the other to the ties, and each carried out his work. The scaffoldings of Filippo were made with so great ingenuity and industry that the very opposite opinion was held in this matter to that which many had previously conceived, for the builders stood on them, working and drawing up weights as securely as if they had been on the surface of the ground, and the models of the said scaffoldings were preserved in the office of works. Lorenzo had the chain of ties made on one of the 8 sides with the greatest difficulty, and when it was finished, the wardens caused Filippo to look at it. To them he said nothing, but he discoursed thereon with some of his friends, saying that it was necessary to have some form of fastening different from that one, and to apply it in a better manner than had been done, and that it was not strong enough to withstand the weight that was to be laid above, for it did not bind the masonry together firmly enough, adding that the supplies given to Lorenzo, as well as the chain that he had caused to be made, had been simply thrown away. The opinion of Filippo became known, and he was charged to show what was the best way of making such a chain. Whereupon, having already made designs and models, he immediately showed them, and when they had been seen by the wardens and the other masters, it was recognized into what great error they had fallen by favoring Lorenzo, and wishing to atone for this error, and to show that they knew what was good, they made Filippo overseer and superintendent of the whole fabric for life, saying that nothing should be done in that work without his command. And as a proof of approbation, they gave him 100 florins, decreed by the consuls and wardens, under date of August 13th, 1423, by the hand of Lorenzo Paoli, notary to the office of works, and under the name of Gherardo di Messer Filippo Corsini. And they voted him an allowance of 100 florins a year as a provision for life. Wherefore, giving orders for the building to be pushed on, he pursued it with such scrupulous care and so great attention that not a stone could be put into place without his having wished to see it. Lorenzo, on the other hand, finding himself vanquished, and as it were put to shame, was favoured and assisted by his friends so powerfully that he went on drawing his salary, claiming that he could not be dismissed until 3 years had passed. Filippo was for ever making, on the slightest occasion, designs and models of stages for the builders and of machines for lifting weights. But this did not prevent certain malicious persons, friends of Lorenzo, from putting Filippo into despair by spending their whole time in making models in opposition to his, insomuch that some were made by one Maestro Antonio da Verzelli and other favoured masters, and were brought into notice, now by one citizen and now by another, demonstrating their inconstancy, their little knowledge, and their even smaller understanding, since, having perfection in their grasp, they brought forward the imperfect and the useless. The ties were now finished, right round the 8 sides, and the masons, being encouraged, were labouring valiantly. But, being pressed more than usual by Filippo, and resenting certain reprimands received with regard to the building and other things that were happening every day, they had conceived a grievance against him. Wherefore, moved by this and by envy, the 4 men leagued themselves together into a faction, and declared that the work was laborious and dangerous, and that they would not build the cupola without great payment, although their pay had been raised higher than usual, thinking in this way to take vengeance on Filippo and to gain profit for themselves. This affair displeased the wardens and also Filippo, who, having pondered over it, made up his mind one Saturday evening to dismiss them all. They, seeing themselves dismissed and not knowing how the matter would end, were very evilly disposed. But on the following Monday, Filippo set 10 Lombards to work, and by standing ever over them and saying, "Do this here and do that there," he taught them so much in one day that they worked there for many weeks. The masons, on the other hand, seeing themselves dismissed, deprived of their work, and thus disgraced, and having no work as profitable as this, sent mediators to Filippo, saying that they would willingly return, and recommending themselves to him as much as they were able. Filippo kept them for many days in suspense as to his willingness to take them back. Then he reinstated them at lower wages than they had before, and thus, where they thought to gain, they lost, and in taking vengeance on Filippo, they brought harm and disgrace on themselves. The murmurings were now silenced, and meanwhile, on seeing that building being raised so readily, men had come to recognize the genius of Filippo, and it was already held by those who were not prejudiced that he had shown such courage as perchance no ancient or modern architect had shown in his works. This came to pass because he brought out his model, wherein all could see how much thought he had given to the planning of the staircases and of the lights both within and without, in order that no one might be injured in the darkness by reason of fear, and how many diverse balusters of iron he had placed where the ascent was steep for the staircases, arranging them with much consideration. Besides this, he had even thought of the irons for fixing scaffoldings within, in case mosaics or paintings had ever to be wrought there, and in like manner by placing the different kinds of water conduits, some covered and some uncovered, in the least dangerous positions, and by duly accompanying these with holes and diverse apertures, to the end that the force of the winds might be broken, and that neither exhalations nor the tremblings of the earth might be able to do any harm. He showed how great assistance he had received from his studies during the many years that he stayed in Rome. And in addition, when men considered what he had done in the way of dovetailing, joining, fixing, and binding together the stones, it made them marvel and tremble to think that one single mind should have been capable of all that the mind of Filippo had proved itself able to execute. So greatly did his powers continue to increase, that there was nothing, however difficult and formidable, that he did not render easy and simple. And this he showed in the lifting of weights by means of counterweights and wheels, so that one ox could raise what 6 pairs could scarcely have raised before. The building had now risen to such a height that it was a very great inconvenience for any one who had climbed to the top to descend to the ground, and the builders lost much time in going to eat and drink, and suffered great discomfort in the heat of the day. Filippo, therefore, made arrangements for eating houses with kitchens to be opened on the cupola, and for wine to be sold there, so that no one had to leave his labor until the evening, which was convenient for the men and very advantageous for the work. Seeing the work making great progress and succeeding so happily, Filippo had grown so greatly in courage that he was continually laboring, going in person to the furnaces where the bricks were being shaped, and demanding to see the clay and to feel its consistency, and insisting on selecting them with his own hand when baked, with the greatest diligence. When the stone cutters were working at the stones, he would look at them to see if they showed flaws, and if they were hard, and he would give the men models in wood or wax, or made simply out of turnips, and he would also make iron tools for the smiths. He invented hinges with heads and hinge hooks, and he did much to facilitate architecture, which was certainly brought by him to a perfection such as it probably had never enjoyed among the Tuscans. In the year 1423, the greatest possible happiness and rejoicing were prevailing in Florence, when Filippo was chosen as one of the Signori for the quarter of San Giovanni for May and June, Lapo Niccolini being chosen as Gonfalonier of Justice for the quarter of Santa Croce. And if he is found registered in the Priorista as Filippo di Ser Brunellesco Lippi, no one need marvel, seeing that he was called thus after his grandfather, Lippo, and not De Lapi, as he should have been, which method is seen from the said Priorista to have been used in innumerable other cases, as is well known to all who have seen it or who know the custom of those times. Filippo exercised that office and also other magisterial functions that he obtained in his city, wherein he ever bore himself with most profound judgment. Seeing that the 2 vaults were beginning to close in on the round window where the lantern was to rise, it now remained to Filippo, who had made many models of clay and of wood for both the one and the other in Rome and in Florence, without showing them, to make up his mind finally which of these he would put into execution. Wherefore, having determined to finish the gallery, he made diverse designs, which remained after his death in the office of works, but they have since been lost by reason of the negligence of those officials. In our own day, to the end that the whole might be completed, a part of it was made on one of the 8 sides, but by the advice of Michelangelo Buonarroti, it was abandoned and not carried further, because it clashed with the original plan. Filippo also made with his own hand a model for the lantern. This was octagonal, with proportions in harmony with those of the cupola, and it turned out very beautiful in invention, variety, and adornment. He made therein the staircase for ascending to the ball, which was something divine, but since Filippo had stopped up the entrance with a piece of wood let in below, no one save himself knew of this staircase. And although he was praised, and had now overcome the envy and the arrogance of many, he could not prevent all the other masters who were in Florence from setting themselves at the sight of this model, to make other in various fashions, and finally a lady of the house of Gaddi had the courage to compete with the one made by Filippo. But he, meanwhile, kept laughing at their presumption, and when many of his friends told him that he should not show his model to any craftsman, lest they should learn from it, he would answer that there was but one true model, and that the others were of no account. Some of the other masters had used some of the parts of Filippo's model for their own, and Filippo, on seeing these, would say, "The next model that this man makes will be my very own." Filippo's model was infinitely praised by all, only, not seeing therein the staircase for ascending to the ball, they complained that it was defective. The wardens determined, none the less, to give him the commission for the said work, but on the condition that he should show them the staircase. Whereupon Filippo, removing the small piece of wood that there was at the foot of the model, showed in a pilaster the staircase that is seen at the present day in the form of a hollow blowpipe, having on one side a groove with rungs of bronze, whereby one ascends to the top, putting one foot after another. And because he could not live long enough, by reason of his old age, to see the lantern finished, he left orders in his testament that it should be built as it stood in the model, and as he had directed in writing, protesting that otherwise the structure would collapse, since it was turned with the quarter acute arch, so that it was necessary to burden it with this weight in order to make it stronger. He was not able to see this edifice finished before his death, but he raised it to the height of several braccia, and caused almost all the marbles that were going into it to be well wrought and prepared. And the people, on seeing them prepared, were amazed that it should be possible for him to propose to lay so great a weight on that vaulting. It was the opinion of many ingenious men that it would not bear the weight, and it appeared to them great good fortune that he had carried it so far, and the tempting of Providence to burden it so heavily. Filippo, ever laughing to himself, and having prepared all the machines and all the instruments that were to be used in building it, spent all his time and thought in foreseeing, anticipating, and providing for every detail, even to the point of guarding against the chipping of the dressed marbles as they were drawn up, insomuch that the arches of the tabernacles were built with wooden protections, while for the rest, as it has been said, there were written directions and models. How beautiful is this building! It demonstrates by itself. From the level of the ground to the base of the lantern, it is 154 braccia in height. The body of the lantern is 36 braccia, the copper ball 4 braccia, the cross 8 braccia, and the whole is 202 braccia. And it can be said with confidence that the ancients never went so high with their buildings, and never exposed themselves to so great a risk as to try to challenge the heavens, even as this structure truly appears to challenge them, seeing that it rises to such a height that the mountains round Florence appear no higher. And it seems in truth that the heavens are envious of it, since the lightning keeps on striking it every day. The while that this work was in progress, Filippo made many other buildings, which we will enumerate below in their order. With his own hand, he made the model of the chapter house of Santa Croce in Florence, a varied and very beautiful work for the family of the Pazzi, and the model of the house of the Buccini for the habitation of 2 families, and also the model of the house and loggia of the Innocenti, the vaulting of which was executed without framework, a method that is still followed by all in our own day. It is said that Filippo was summoned to Milan in order to make the model of a fortress for Duke Filippo Maria, and that he left this building of the Innocenti in charge of Francesco della Luna, who was very much his friend. This Francesco made an architrave ornament running downward from above, which is wrong according to the rules of architecture. Wherefore Filippo, on returning, reproved him for having done such a thing. And he answered that he copied it from the church of San Giovanni, which is ancient. There is one sole error, said Filippo, in that edifice, and thou hast followed it. The model of this building, by the hand of Filippo, was for many years in the hands of the Guild of Poor Santa Maria, being held in great account, because a part of the fabric was still unfinished, but it is now lost. He made the model of the Abbey of the Canons Regular of Fiesole for Cosimo de' Medici, the architecture being ornate, commodious, fanciful, and in short, truly magnificent. The church is lofty, with the vaulting barrel-shaped, and the sacristy, like all the rest of the monastery, has its proper conveniences. But what is most important and most worthy of consideration is that, having to place that edifice on the downward slope of that mountain, and yet on the level, he availed himself of the part below with great judgment, making therein cellars, wash-houses, bread ovens, stables, kitchens, rooms for storing firewood, and so many other conveniences, that it is not possible to see anything better. And thus he laid the base of the edifice on the level. Wherefore he was afterwards able to make the loggia, the refectory, the infirmary, the novitiate, the dormitory, and the library, with the other principal rooms proper to a monastery, on one plane. All this was carried out by the magnificent Cosimo de' Medici at his own expense, partly through the piety that he showed in all matters in connection with the Christian faith, and partly through the affection that he bore to Don Timoteo da Verona, a most excellent preacher of that order, whose conversation he was so anxious to enjoy that he also built many rooms for himself in that monastery, and lived there at his own convenience. On this edifice Cosimo spent 100,000 crowns, as may be seen in an inscription. Filippo also designed the model for the fortress of Vico Pisano, and he designed the old citadel of Pisa, and fortified the Ponte a Mare, and also gave the design for the new citadel, closing the bridge with the 2 towers. In like manner, he made the model for the fortress of the port of Pesaro. Returning to Milan, he made many designs for the Duke, and some for the masters of the Duomo of that city. The church of San Lorenzo had been begun in Florence at this time by order of the people of that quarter, who had made the prior superintendent of that building. This person made profession of much knowledge in architecture, and was ever amusing himself therewith by way of pastime. And they had already begun the building by making piers of brick, when Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, who had promised the people of that quarter and the prior to have the sacristy and a chapel made at his own expense, invited Filippo one morning to dine with him, and after much discourse asked him what he thought of the beginning of San Lorenzo. Filippo was constrained by the entreaties of Giovanni to say what he thought, and being compelled to speak the truth, he criticized it in many respects as something designed by a person who had perchance more learning than experience of buildings of that sort. Whereupon Giovanni asked Filippo if something better and more beautiful could be made, to which Filippo replied, "Without a doubt, and I marvel that you, being the chief in the enterprise, do not devote a few thousand crowns to building a body of a church with all its parts worthy of the place and of so many noble owners of tombs, who, seeing it begun, will proceed with their chapels to the best of their power. Above all, because there remains no memorials of us save walls, which bear testimony for hundreds and thousands of years to those who build them." Giovanni, encouraged by the words of Filippo, determined to build the sacristy and the principal chapel together with the whole body of the church, although only 7 families were willing to cooperate, since the others had not the means. These 7 were the Rondinelli, Ginori, Dalla Stufa, Neroni, Ciai, Marignolli, Martelli, and Marco di Luca, and these chapels were to be made in the cross. The sacristy was the first part to be undertaken, and afterwards the church, little by little. The other chapels along the length of the church came to be granted afterwards, one by one, to other citizens of the quarter. The roofing of the sacristy was not finished when Giovanni de' Medici passed to the other life, leaving behind him his son Cosimo, who, having a greater spirit than his father, and delighting in memorials, caused this one to be carried on. It was the first edifice that he erected, and he took so great delight therein, that from that time onwards up to his death he was for ever building. Cosimo pressed this work forward with greater ardor, and while one part was being begun, he would have another finished. Looking on the work as a pastime, he was almost always there, and it was his solicitude that caused Filippo to finish the sacristy, and Donato to make the stucco work with the stone ornaments for those little doors and the doors of bronze. In the middle of the sacristy, where the priests donned their vestments, he had a tomb made for his father Giovanni, under a great slab of marble supported by 4 little columns. And in the same place he made a tomb for his own family, separating that of the women from that of the men. In one of the 2 little rooms that are on either side of the altar in the sad sacristy, he made a well in one corner with a place for a lavatory. In short, everything in this fabric is seen to have been built with much judgment. Giovanni and the others had arranged to make the choir in the middle, below the tribune, but Cosimo changed this at the wish of Filippo, who made the principal chapel, which had been designed at first as a smaller recess, so much greater that he was able to make the choir therein as it is at present. This being finished, there remained to be made the central tribune and the rest of the church. But this tribune, with the rest, was not vaulted until after the death of Filippo. This church is 144 braccia in length, and many errors are seen therein, one being that the columns are placed on the level of the ground instead of being raised on a dado, which should have been as high as the level of the bases of the pilasters which stand on the steps, so that, as one sees the pilasters shorter than the columns, the whole of that work appears badly proportioned. All this was caused by the counsels of his successors, who were jealous of his name and had made models in opposition to his during his lifetime. For these, they had been put to shame with sonnets written by Filippo, and after his death, they took vengeance on him in this manner, not only in this work, but in all those that remained to be carried out by them. He left the model for the presbytery of the priests of San Lorenzo, and part of the building finished, wherein he made the cloister 144 braccia in length. The while that this edifice was building, Cosimo de' Medici determined to have a palace made for himself, and therefore revealed his intention to Filippo, who, putting aside every other care, made him a great and very beautiful model for the said palace, which he wished to place opposite to San Lorenzo on the piazza, entirely isolated on every side. In this, the art of Filippo had achieved so much that Cosimo, thinking it too sumptuous and great a fabric, refrained from putting it into execution, more to avoid envy than by reason of the cost. While the model was making, Filippo used to say that he thanked his fortune for such an opportunity, seeing that he had such a house to build as he had desired for many years, and because he had come across a man who had the wish and the means to have it built. But on learning afterward the determination of Cosimo not to put this project into execution, in disdain he broke the design into 1,000 pieces. Deeply did Cosimo repent, after he had made that other palace, that he had not adopted the design of Filippo. And this Cosimo was wont to say, that he had never spoken to a man of greater intelligence and spirit than Filippo. He also made the model of the most bizarre Temple of the Angeli for the family of the Scolari, but it remained unfinished and in the condition wherein it is now to be seen, because the Florentines spent the money which lay in the Monte for this purpose on certain requirements of their city, or, as some say, in the war they waged formerly against the people of Lucca, wherein they also spent the money that had been left in like manner by Niccolo d'Auzzano for building the Sapienza, as it has been related at length in another place. And, in truth, if this Temple of the Angeli had been finished according to the model of Brunellesco, it would have been one of the rarest things in Italy, for the reason that what is seen of it cannot be sufficiently extolled. The drawings by the hand of Filippo for the ground plan and for the completion of this octagonal temple are in our book, with other designs by the same man. Filippo also designed a rich and magnificent palace for Messer Luca Pitti at a place called Rucciano, without the Porta San Niccolò in Florence. But this failed by a great measure to equal the one that he began in Florence for the same man, carrying it to the second range of windows, with such grandeur and magnificence that nothing more rare or more magnificent has yet been seen in the Tuscan manner. The doors of this palace are double, with the opening 16 braccia in length and 8 in breadth. The windows both of the first and second range are in every way similar to these doors, and the vaultings double. And the whole edifice is so masterly in design that any more beautiful or more magnificent architecture cannot be imagined. The builder of this palace was Luca Fancelli, an architect of Florence, who erected many buildings for Filippo, and one for Leon Battista Alberti, namely the principal chapel of the Nunziata in Florence, by order of Lodovico Gonzaga, who took him to Mantua, where he made many works and married a wife, and lived and died, leaving heirs, who are still called the Lucchi from his name. This palace was bought not many years ago by the most illustrious lady Leonora di Toledo, Duchess of Florence, on the advice of the most illustrious Lord Duke Cosimo, her consort, and she increased the grounds all round it so greatly that she made a very large garden, partly on the plain, partly on the top of the hill, and partly on the slope, filling it with all the sorts of trees, both of the garden and of the forest, most beautifully laid out, and making most delightful little groves with innumerable sorts of evergreens, which flourish in every season, to say nothing of the waters, the fountains, the conduits, the fish ponds, the fowling places, the espaliers, and an infinity of other things worthy of a magnanimous prince, about which I will be silent, because it is not possible, without seeing them, ever to imagine their grandeur and their beauty. And in truth, Duke Cosimo could have chanced upon nothing more worthy of the power and greatness of his mind than this palace, which might truly appear to have been erected by Messer Luca Pitti from the design of Brunellesco for his most illustrious excellency. Messer Luca left it unfinished by reason of his cares in connection with the state, and his heirs, having no means wherewith to complete it, and being unwilling to let it go to ruin, were content to make it over to the Duchess, who was ever spending money on it as long as she lived, but not so much as to give hope that it would be soon finished. It is true, indeed, according to what I once heard, that she was minded to spend 40,000 ducats in 1 year alone, if she lived, in order to see it, if not finished, at least well on the way to completion. And because the model of Filippo has not been found, His Excellency has caused Bartolomeo Ammanati, an excellent sculptor and architect, to make another, according to which the work is being carried on, and a great part of the courtyard is already completed in rustic work, similar to the exterior. And in truth, if one considers the grandeur of this work, one marvels how the mind of Filippo could conceive so great an edifice, which is truly magnificent, not only in the external facade, but also in the distribution of all the apartments. I say nothing of the view, which is most beautiful, and of the kind of theatre formed by the most lovely hills that rise round the palace in the direction of the walls, because, as I have said, it would take too long to try to describe them in full, nor could anyone, without seeing this palace, imagine how greatly superior it is to any other royal edifice whatsoever. It is also said that the machinery for the paradise of San Felice in Piazza, in the said city, was invented by Filippo in order to hold the representation, or rather the festival of the Annunciation, in the manner wherein the Florentines were wont to hold it in that place in olden times. This was truly something marvelous, demonstrating the genius and the industry of him who was its inventor, for the reason that there was seen on high a heaven full of living figures in motion, with an infinity of lights appearing and disappearing almost in a flash. Now, I do not wish to grudge the labor of giving an exact description of the machinery of that engine, seeing that it has all disappeared, and that the men who could speak of it from personal knowledge are dead, so that there is no hope of its being reconstructed, that place being inhabited no longer by the monks of Camaldoli, but by the nuns of San Pier Martire, and above all, since the one in the Carmine has been destroyed, because it was pulling down the rafters that support the roof. For this purpose, then, Filippo had suspended between two of the beams that supported the roof of the church the half of a globe in the shape of an empty bowl, or rather of a barber's basin, with the rim downwards. This half-globe was made of thin and light planks fastened to a star of iron, which radiated round the curve of the said half-globe, and these planks narrowed towards the point of equilibrium in the centre, where there was a great ring of iron, round which there radiated the iron star that secured the planks of the half-globe. The whole mass was upheld by a stout beam of pine wood, well shod with iron, which lay across the timbers of the roof, and to this beam was fastened the ring that sustained and balanced the half-globe, which from the ground truly appeared like a heaven. At the foot of the inner edge it had certain wooden brackets, large enough for one person to stand on and no more, and at the height of one braccio there was also an iron fastening, likewise on the inner edge. On each of these brackets there was placed a boy about 12 years old, who was girt round with the iron fastening 1 braccio and a half high, in such wise that he could not have fallen down, even if he had wanted to. These boys, who were 12 in all, were placed on the brackets, as it had been said, and dressed like angels, with gilded wings and hair made of gold thread, and when it was time, they took one another by the hand and waved their arms, so that they appeared to be dancing, and the rather as the half-globe was ever moving and turned around. Within it, above the heads of the angels, were 3 circles or garlands of lights, contained in certain little lamps that could not be overturned. From the ground, these lights appeared like stars, and the brackets, being covered with cotton wool, appeared like clouds. From the aforesaid ring there issued a very stout bar of iron, which had at the end another ring, to which there was fastened a thin rope reaching to the ground, as it will be told later. That said stout bar of iron had 8 arms, spreading out in an arc, large enough to fill the space within the hollow half-globe, and at the end of each arm there was a stand about the size of a trencher. On each stand was a boy about 9 years old, well secured by an iron soldered on to the upper part of the arm, but loosely enough to allow him to turn in every direction. These 8 angels, supported by the said iron, were lowered from the space within the half-globe by means of a small windlass that was unwound little by little to a depth of 8 braccia below the level of the square beams that support the roof, in such a manner that they were seen without concealing the view of the angels who were round the inner edge of the half-globe. In the midst of this cluster of 8 angels, for so was it rightly called, was a mandorla of copper, hollow within, wherein were many holes, showing certain little lamps fixed on iron bars in the form of tubes, which lamps, on the touching of a spring which could be pressed down, were all hidden within the mandorla of copper, whereas, when the spring was not pressed down, all the lamps could be seen alight through some holes therein. When the cluster of angels had reached its place, this mandorla, which was fastened to the aforesaid little rope, was lowered very gradually by the unwinding of the rope with another little windlass, and arrived at the platform where the representation took place. And on this platform, precisely on the spot where the mandorla was to rest, there was a raised place in the shape of a throne, with 4 steps, in the center of which there was a hole wherein the iron point of the mandorla stood upright. Below the said throne was a man who, when the mandorla had reached its place, made it fast with a bolt without being seen, so that it stood firmly on its base. Within the mandorla was a youth, about 15 years of age, in the guise of an angel, girt round the middle with an iron, and secured by a bolt to the foot of the mandorla in a manner that he could not fall. And to the end that he might be able to kneel, the said iron was divided into 3 parts, whereof one part entered readily into another as he knelt. Thus, when the cluster of angels had descended and the mandorla was resting on the throne, the man who fixed the mandorla with the bolt also unbolted the iron that supported the angel, whereupon he issued forth and walked across the platform, and, having come to where the Virgin was, saluted her and made the Annunciation. He then returned into the mandorla, and the lights, which had gone out on his issuing forth, being rekindled, the iron that supported him was once more bolted by the man who was concealed below. The bolt that held the mandorla firm was removed, and he was drawn up again, while the singing of the angels in the cluster and of those in the heaven who kept circling round made it appear truly a paradise, and the rather because, in addition to the said choir of angels into the cluster, there was a God the Father on the outer edge of the globe, surrounded by angels similar to those named above, and supported by irons, in such wise that the heaven, the God the Father, the cluster, and the mandorla, with innumerable lights and very sweet music, truly represented paradise. In addition to this, in order to be able to open and close that heaven, Filippo had made 2 great doors, each 5 braccia, both in length and breadth, which had rollers of iron, or rather of copper, in certain grooves running horizontally. And these grooves were oiled in a manner that, when a thin rope, which was on either side, was spooled by means of a little windlass, anyone could open or close the heaven at his pleasure, the 2 parts of the door coming together or drawing apart horizontally along the grooves. and these two doors may thus served for two purposes. When they were moved, being heavy, they made a noise like thunder, and when they were closed, they formed a platform for the appareling of the angels and for the making of the other preparations which it was necessary to carry out within. These engines, made thus, together with many others, were invented by Filippo, although others maintain that they had been invented long before. However this may be, it was well to speak of them, seeing that they have gone completely out of use. But to return to Filippo himself, his renown and his name had grown so great that he was sent for from far distant places by all who wished to erect buildings, in their desire to have designs and models by the hand of so great a man. And to this end the most powerful means and friendships were employed. Wherefore the Marquis of Mantua, among others, desiring to have him, wrote with great insistence to the Signoria of Florence, by whom he was sent to that city, where he gave designs for dikes on the Po, and certain other works according to the pleasure of that prince, who treated him very lovingly, being wont to say that Florence was as worthy to have Filippo as a citizen as he was to have so noble and beautiful a city for his birthplace. In Pisa, likewise, Count Francesco Sforza and Niccolo da Pisa, being surpassed by him in the making of certain fortifications, commended him in his presence, saying that if every state possessed a man like Filippo, it would be possible to live in security without arms. In Florence also, Filippo gave the design for the house of the Barbadori, near the tower of the Rossi in the Borgo San Jacopo, but it was not put into execution, and he also made the design for the house of the Giuntini on the Piazza d'Ognissanti on the Arno. Afterwards, the captains of the Guelph party in Florence, wishing to build an edifice containing a hall and an audience chamber for that body, gave the commission to Francesco della Luna, who began the work, and he had already raised it to the height of 10 braccia above the ground, making many errors therein, when it was put into the hands of Filippo, who brought the said palace to that magnificent form which we see. In this work he had to compete with the said Francesco, who was favored by many. Even so did he spend his whole life, competing now with one man and now with another, for many were ever making war against him and harassing him, and very often seeking to gain honor for themselves with his designs, so that he was reduced in the end to showing nothing and trusting no one. The hall of this palace is no longer used by the sad captains of the Guelphs, because the flood of the year 1557 did so great damage to the papers of the Monte that the Lord Duke Cosimo, for the greater security of the said papers, which are of the greatest importance, removed them to the said hall, together with the institution itself. And to the end that the old staircase of this palace might serve for the said body of captains, who gave up that hall in favor of the Monte and retired to another part of that palace, Giorgio Vasari was commissioned by His Excellency to make the very commodious staircase that now ascends to the said hall of the Monte. In like manner, from a design by the same man, there was made a coffer-work ceiling, which was placed, after the plan of Filippo, on certain fluted pillars of grey stone. One year, the Lenten sermons in Santo Spirito had been preached by Maestro Francesco Zoppo, who was then very dear to the people of Florence, and he had strongly recommended the claims of that convent, of the school for youths, and particularly of the church, which had been burnt down about that time. Whereupon the chief men of that quarter, Lorenzo Ridolfi, Bartolomeo Corbinelli, Neri di Gino Capponi, and Goro di Staggiodati, with very many other citizens, obtained an order from the Signoria for the rebuilding of the church of Santo Spirito, and made Stoldo Frescobaldi proveditore. This man, by reason of the interest that he had in the old church, the principal chapel and the high altar of which belonged to his house, took very great pains therewith. Nay, at the beginning, before the money had been collected from the taxes imposed on the owners of burial places and chapels, he spent many thousands of crowns of his own, for which he was repaid. Now, after the matter had been discussed, Filippo was sent for and asked to make a model with all the features, both useful and honorable, that might be possible and suitable to a Christian church. Whereupon he urged strongly that the ground plan of that edifice should be turned right round, because he greatly desired that the square should extend to the bank of the Arno, to the end that all those who passed that way from Genoa, from the Riviera, from the Lunigiana, and from the districts of Pisa and Lucca might see the magnificence of that building. But since certain citizens objected, refusing to have their houses pulled down, the desire of Filippo did not take effect. He made the model of the church, therefore, with that of the habitation of the monks, in the form wherein it stands today. The length of the church was 161 braccia, and the width 54 braccia, and it was so well planned, both in the ordering of the columns and in the rest of the ornaments, that it would be impossible to make a work richer, more lovely, or more graceful than that one. And in truth, but for the malevolence of those who are ever spoiling the beautiful beginnings of any work, in order to appear to have more understanding than others, this would now be the most perfect church in Christendom. And even as it stands, it is more lovely and better designed than any other, although it has not been carried out according to the model, as may be seen from certain parts begun on the outside, wherein the design observed within has not been followed, as it appears from the model that the doors and the borders round the windows were meant to do. There are some errors attributed to him, about which I will be silent, for it is believed that if he had completed the building he would not have endured them, seeing that he had brought all his work to perfection with so much judgment, discrimination, intellect, and art. And this work likewise established him as a genius truly divine. Filippo was very humorous in his discourse, and very acute in repartee, as he showed when he wished to hit at Lorenzo Ghiberti, who had bought a farm on Monte Morello called Lepriano, on which he spent twice as much as he gained by way of income, so that he grew weary of this and sold it. Someone asked Filippo what was the best thing that Lorenzo had ever done, thinking perchance, by reason of the enmity between them, that he would criticize Lorenzo, and he replied, "The selling of Lepriano." Finally, having now grown very old, he was 69 years of age, he passed to a better life, on April 16th, in the year 1446, after having exhausted himself greatly in making the works that enabled him to win an honored name on earth, and to obtain a place of repose in heaven. His death caused infinite grief to his country, which recognized and esteemed him much more when dead than it had done when he was alive, and he was buried with the most honorable obsequies and distinctions in Santa Maria del Fiore, although his burial place was in San Marco, under the pulpit opposite to the door, where there is a coat of arms with 2 fig leaves and certain green waves on a field of gold, because his family came from the district of Ferrara, that is, from Ficaruolo, a township on the Po, as it is shown by the leaves, which denote the place, and by the waves, which signify the river. He was mourned by innumerable brother craftsmen, and particularly by the poorer among them, whom he was ever helping. Thus, then, living the life of a Christian, he left to the world the sweet savor of his goodness and of his noble talents. It seems to me that it can be said for him that from the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans to our own, there has been no rarer or more excellent master than Filippo, and he is all the more worthy of praise because in his times the German manner was held in veneration throughout all Italy and practiced by the old craftsmen, as it may be seen in innumerable edifices. He recovered the ancient moldings and restored the Tuscan, Corinthian, Doric, and Ionic orders to their original forms. He had a disciple from Borgo a Buggiano, called Il Buggiano, who made the lavatory of the sacristy of Santa Reparata with certain boys who pour out water, and he made a head of his master in marble, taken from the life, which was placed, after the death of Filippo, in Santa Maria del Fiore, beside the door on the right hand as one enters the church, where there is also the following epitaph, placed there by public decree, in order to honor him after his death, even as he had honored his country when alive. Deo Sacrum. Quantum Philippus architectus arte Daedalia valuerit, cum huius celeberrimi templi mira testudo, tum plures aliae divino ingenio ab eo ad inventae machinae documento esse possunt, qua propter ob eximias sui animi dotes singularesque virtutes, die 15 ante calendas Maias, anno 1446, eius bonae memoriae corpus, hac humo supposita grata patria sepelire iusit. To do him even greater honor, others have gone so far as to add these two other inscriptions. Filippo Brunelleschi, antiquae architecturae instauratori, senatus populusque Florentiae, civi suo benemerenti. Giovan Battista Strozzi, May 2nd. Tal sopra sasso di giro in giro eternamente io strussi, che così passo passo alto girando al ciel mi ricondussi. Other disciples of Filippo were Domenico dal Lago di Lugano, Geremia da Cremona, who worked very well in bronze, together with his Sclavonian, who made many works in Venice, Simone, who died at Vicovaro while executing a great work for the Count of Tagliacozzo, after having made the Madonna in the Or San Michele for the Guild of the Apothecaries, Antonio and Niccolo, both Florentines, who working in metal at Ferrara made a horse of bronze for Duke Borso in the year 1461, and many others, of whom it would take too long to make particular mention. Filippo was unfortunate in certain respects, for besides the fact that he ever had someone to contend with, some of his buildings were not completed in his time and are still unfinished. To mention only one, it was a great pity that the monks of the Angeli, as it has been said, could not finish the temple begun by him, since, after they had spent on the portion that is now seen more than 3,000 crowns, drawn partly from the Guild of Merchants and partly from the Monte, where their money was kept, the capital was squandered, and the building remained, as it still remains, unfinished. Wherefore, as it was said in the life of Niccolo d'Auzzano, if a man desires to leave such memorials behind him, let him do it for himself the while that he lives, and let him not put his trust in anyone. And what has been said of this edifice could be said of many others designed by Filippo Brunelleschi.